Greetings and welcome to the final module of the Virtual Adolescent Literacy Foundations Training. You've worked your way through the Content Literacy Overview, Academic Dialogue, Writing to Learn, and Vocabulary Development modules. Now it's time to see how we bring all of that together to support instruction in the classroom planning. You go to the Google site, you scroll over to the Planning tab, come down to this section. Here's the video that you're watching. Besides that is a double entry organizer. The double entry organizer is the structure we're going to use for today's reading comprehension strategy. You'll notice we give you some prompts on the left-hand side. That's where you add some of the thinking that we're sharing with you. But more importantly, it's that right-hand side where you're going to make the connections to what you already know about instruction in your discipline. But you're also going to make connections to what we've been talking about during the training. It's that part that really allows you to figure out what this means for you, and that's going to be the power of this tool. You'll use this tool when it comes to planning as well as when we get to the conversation later in this module. The second document is this minimum daily learning sequence. The minimum daily learning sequence is what we have learned through research around planning and instruction, coupled with our experiences in supporting teachers in implementing literacy in their classroom. The goal of the MDLS, or Minimum Daily Learning Sequence, is creating a coherent experience using literacy purposefully to support clear learning objectives. And those three pieces, coherent experience, purposeful literacy, and clear learning objectives, create the foundation of the Minimum Daily Learning Sequence. That coherent experience is making sure that we're getting at the content at the level it was designed to be taught at, making sure that we're getting to those higher level standards. In order to do that, we want to make sure that we're creating processes that allow students to be successful with that content. That's where that coherence comes into play. It's that interplay between content and process. And those processes come from literacy. We want to make sure we're being very purposeful in choosing literacy strategies that help us meet our objectives. What we don't want to do is say, oh, we're all going to do word walls. That's choosing the strategy first, but it's more important to think about, I know that I have to have my students having interactions with the content. They have to have those 20 to 25 interactions with the terminology to show mastery. So how do I plan that into my daily experience? And from my perspective, the interactive word wall is a great strategy to do that. That's a great choice why you use that strategy, not just to do the strategy of a word wall. And last but certainly not least, in fact, where we really start is clear learning objectives. We want to make sure that you, the content expert, are choosing the objectives for your instruction that meet your needs. And then everything else is designed to support that and support students in being successful in that. When we look at the minimum daily learning sequence, we know there are 4 components to it. The first is activating the lesson. It's important that we hook the student, activate what they already know, get them engaged in the process, engaged in the instruction. What we know is this: you can't get to rigor without going through engagement. We want to make sure that first component of the minimum daily learning sequence does that, helps engage the learner actively learning in this lesson. The second component of the minimum daily learning sequence is how do we access information? As part of this training, we've always given you some tool when you're doing reading or when you're watching a video that helps you organize your thinking, track your thinking, prompts you to do some thinking around different terms. We want to make sure that we're giving the students the opportunity to consume that information effectively. Then the third component of the DLS is this idea of how do we apply or process that information. We want to make sure that we're giving the students the opportunity to not just get the details, but grapple with it and organize it so that it's useful to them as they move forward in their learning. It's important here that as we think about this application and process section, and we're thinking about a variety of approaches that have students interacting with the content. We want to make sure that we're having them talk about the content, write about the content. They've already maybe done a little bit of reading or listening. So we want to make sure we're getting that balanced approach to literacy. We know that when you're reading versus writing versus speaking and listening, you're using different parts of the brain, and that balanced approach helps strengthen the learning and deepen the learning and make it easier for long-term storage. Another important component that helps with long-term storage is closing synthesis, helping the students organize the content and when applicable, also organize processes, making sure they understand the steps that go into those critical thinking steps. And we want to make sure that they're thinking about those, especially at the adolescent level, that middle and high school level, where the metacognitive component of their learning is equally as important as the content as we set them up for future success long term. When you look at this framework again, this matrix, that second column gives a little bit more detail than about what I was just talking about. The third column are some possible strategies. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list of strategies. If you go back to the Appendix C in the back of the Foundations Guidebook, there are more. But you also have more tools at your disposal. From training you've done individually, perhaps as a department, or even at the school level. It's important to recognize, though, that one of the powers of the adolescent literacy model is common language and common strategies to help students generalize those strategies across multiple contents. So, for instance, if a student is using a see, think, wonder, it's going to be pretty common, it's going to be pretty consistent across different classrooms, but you're going to have different focus. If you're in a science classroom and you're looking at data from an experimental experience that they've done, they're going to be looking at that data differently than if I'm in a social studies classroom and I'm looking at data from the 1950s civil rights marches. That data we're going to be looking at and thinking about, how do I contextualize it? How do I corroborate? How do I triangulate that data? Whereas when I'm looking at that science experimental data, I'm going to be thinking about the experiment. I'm going to be thinking about my hypothesis. So I'm just going to be processing it differently. That's the importance of you being the content expert and knowing what your purpose is for that strategy. Once the students learn a strategy like see, think, wonder, we just want them to tweak and understand how each one is applied in those different settings. And last but certainly not least is this fourth column. And this is the idea of identifying the subdomain that the strategy comes from. Again, it's the focus of trying to find that balanced approach to literacy. We should be reading, writing, speaking, and listening every day in every classroom. It's how we learn. It's how students process information. So we want to make sure that we're giving them a balanced approach to that. Again, that whole brain experience. This is a great moment for us to take a pause break, for you to go back to your double entry organizer, get caught up with where we are, make some connections to things, ask yourself some questions. Okay, we're back. So let's now jump from the minimum daily learning sequence to that framework applied to one of our learning activities. Here was the content literacy overview. I'm not going to walk you through the entire thing. You can read what we did here, and you've already experienced it. We started off with a writing to learn, getting you thinking about organizing your thinking, and went through a little activity there. Then we came into the first reading that we did, and it's very important that we gave you the reading, the purpose for the reading, the strategy we're going to use for the reading, and what we were going to expect you to do with that reading when we came out of it, so that you were prepared as you were processing or garnering the information to be successful long term. We used text codes and margin notes, really just thinking about what is content literacy. So what was important, what are some questions, what connects to what you already know, so that you could have that conversation with your colleagues and peers later. The next part of that is you took that and you used that reading, went back through that reading to identify 5 terms from the reading that capture the essence of content literacy. You'll notice we didn't put that as part of the reading. Our focus on the reading was for you to consume it, make connections to it. If we had given you those alpha blocks when we started the reading, you would have read for a very different reason. You would have been reading for the terminology as opposed to reading for the content. Now that you read it, the second reading, a little quicker reading, was to identify some of those key components, those key terms. So we set you up for success for that, and then we took you into a list group label where you worked together to organize that into the different key characteristics of the reading. Lastly, I want to talk about this idea of closing and synthesis. We took you into a quick write on why and how is content literacy important to student success in my classroom. Again, what we know is you're adult learners, and this is how is this affecting me in my classroom. When we had you organize your thinking, begin thinking about this idea of what does this look like for me. If we had been in a face-to-face training, we would have immediately then had you debrief some of that writing with an academic dialogue strategy, maybe a think, pair, share, or a small group debrief of the day. But again, thinking about how we would have coupled the different parts of that thinking so that we get more of the brain involved. Because we were in a virtual environment and it was a relatively asynchronous, where you were doing some on your own and some together, we decided to drop the academic dialogue part so that we could just get that final piece and get you to share some of that so that we would have it long